In January of 2025, New York City tried to count every single homeless person sleeping outside. They had to cancel. The cold was so extreme that organizers decided it was too dangerous to send volunteers out into the streets. It was too cold for trained volunteers with warm coats and hot coffee to spend a few hours outside. But for the estimated 4,500 people sleeping unsheltered in that city, those same conditions weren't optional. They were just Tuesday night, and a $300 thermal shelter was already starting to change how cities deal with exactly this problem. By the time that winter ended, more than 20 people had been found dead outdoors across the 5 boroughs, and New York isn't even the worst of it. Across the United States in 2023 alone, roughly 2,520 people died from hypothermia. That number is up 35% from just a decade earlier. And in 2022, during brutal winter storms that swept across the Great Plains and the eastern seaboard, the death toll climbed past 3,500. But while those numbers were climbing, something else was happening in church parking lots and empty lots in smaller cities across America. Engineers, nonprofits, and even a few city councils started asking a very different question. Instead of spending millions on massive shelter buildings that many homeless people refuse to enter, what if you could build something small, warm, and nearly indestructible for the price of a used smartphone? That question led to one of the most practical innovations in emergency housing in decades. And to understand why it matters so much, you have to look at why the systems we already have keep failing the people most likely to die. Every major city in America has some version of a cold weather emergency plan. When temperatures drop below a certain threshold, warming centers open their doors inside community buildings and government offices. Shelters extend their hours. Outreach teams fan out across parks and underpasses looking for people sleeping outside. In Washington, D.C., they trigger what they call cold alert when the wind chill drops below a specific number. Baltimore has its code blue system that activates when the wind chill hits 13 degrees or lower. Los Angeles activates an emergency response when the National Weather Service forecasts 3 consecutive days of freezing nighttime temperatures. These systems exist. They're funded. They have staff and hotlines and transportation budgets. But the people most at risk of dying in the cold are often the exact people these programs can't reach. The National Coalition for the Homeless has been tracking this for years. According to their research, approximately 700 people experiencing homelessness are killed by hypothermia every single year in the United States. That's roughly 2 people per day, every day, from November through March. And many of them die within walking distance of a warming center they chose not to enter. That sounds like a personal choice, and in some ways it is. But the reasons people avoid traditional shelters inside gymnasiums and converted warehouses tell a story that's much harder to dismiss. Some people struggle with severe mental illness that makes crowded, noisy rooms feel genuinely terrifying. Others have been victims of theft or physical violence inside congregate shelters and would rather take their chances with the cold than share a floor with strangers. Some have a dog that's been their only companion for years, and shelters don't allow pets. Some are couples, and most shelters separate men from women. And a significant number are older adults with compromised immune systems who know from experience that sleeping on a gymnasium floor next to dozens of coughing, sneezing strangers is a fast track to pneumonia. California's hospital data makes this painfully clear. Homeless Californians represent less than 0.5% of the state's total population, but they account for 18% of all hypothermia-related hospitalizations and emergency room visits. Run those numbers, and a homeless person in California is roughly 40 times more likely to end up in the hospital from cold exposure than someone with a roof over their head. And the group being hit hardest isn't the one you might expect. It's not young people sleeping under bridges in San Francisco. It's seniors. People 55 and older now account for more than 3/4 of all hypothermia deaths in the state. Researchers at UC San Francisco have projected that the proportion of the homeless population over age 65 will triple between 2017 and 2030. So this crisis isn't peaking. It's accelerating towards something much worse. So if traditional shelters can't reach the most vulnerable people, and warming centers only open under specific weather conditions, what actually works? That's where Aurora, Colorado changed the conversation. In 2021, the city of Aurora was staring at the same gap every mid-sized American city was dealing with. Roughly 600 people were seeking emergency shelter, but the city only had 150 available beds. Winter was approaching fast, and city council members needed solutions they could deploy in weeks, not years. They approved the purchase of 30 pallet shelters, those prefabricated aluminum and composite panel units that can be assembled in about 45 minutes with minimal tools. Those 30 units cost the city approximately $290,000, funded through the American Rescue Plan Act and Federal Emergency Solutions grants. But alongside those pallet units, the council also purchased 30 insulated ice fishing tents. Each one cost roughly $300 before adding a heating element. $300. That's less than a single night in a hospital emergency room, less than a month of storage rental for someone's belongings, less than the fine some cities charge people for sleeping in a public park. These tents weren't fancy and they weren't permanent. They didn't have smart sensors or solar panels or locking doors. They were insulated shells with a heating element set up in rows on city-owned land. But when you're sleeping on frozen ground in a Colorado December and the wind chill drops below zero, an insulated shell between you and the air is the difference between waking up in the morning and never waking up again. The ice fishing tent approach worked because it understood something that most shelter programs miss entirely. The single most important factor in surviving extreme cold isn't comfort. It isn't aesthetics. It's the thermal barrier. The reason that $300 tent works comes down to basic physics. Your body at rest generates roughly 100 watts of heat, about as much as an old incandescent light bulb. In open air, wind and moisture strip that heat away in minutes. Your core temperature starts dropping, and once it falls below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, hypothermia sets in. Confusion, slurred speech, loss of coordination. At 86 degrees, you lose consciousness. Below 82, your heart stops. But inside even a basic insulated enclosure, that same 100 watts of body heat can raise the interior temperature 20 to 30 degrees above the outside air. Add a windproof shell and a reflective inner lining, and you have essentially built a heat trap. Multi-layer thermal barriers work by combining a tough outer shell that blocks wind and rain, an insulating core that slows heat transfer, and a reflective interior surface that bounces radiant body heat back toward the person inside. It is the same principle behind the Mylar blankets that NASA developed for astronauts, except applied to a structure you can set up on a sidewalk in 15 minutes. At minus 40 degrees, which hits parts of Minnesota, Montana, the Dakotas, and Alaska every winter, that barrier is everything. The difference between life and death is literally a few layers of insulation and a zipper. But Aurora's ice fishing tents were just the starting point. And while the engineering was simple, scaling it to more cities revealed problems nobody had anticipated. Pallet Shelters, a company based in Everett, Washington, has deployed over 100 shelter villages across the United States since 2017. Their standard unit is 64 square feet of floor space, built from rot-resistant composite panels, equipped with foldable cots, storage space, windows, and climate control for heating and cooling. The walls are insulated. The doors lock from the inside. The whole structure can withstand winds of 110 miles per hour and snow loads of 25 pounds per square foot. Each unit starts at about $7,500. For context, the average cost of building one unit of permanent supportive housing in Los Angeles has been reported at over $500,000. A pallet shelter delivers warmth, safety, and privacy at roughly 1/60th of that cost, and it can be standing and occupied in under an hour. In Portland, Oregon, Oregon, 4T pallet shelters were installed at a homeless camp just 2 days before Thanksgiving in 2020. The camp had been running on regular tents for months, and fall windstorms had shredded several of them. One resident described that first night inside his new pallet shelter, and the way he talked about it, you'd think someone had handed him the keys to a house. He said he slept harder than he had in years. He said he woke up and his fingers weren't numb for the first time in months. He described the feeling as almost indescribable. After weeks of sleeping on the ground behind a chain-link fence in a tent that rattled every time the wind blew, he finally had walls that didn't move, a door that locked from the inside. He finally had actual warmth. For someone who hadn't had privacy in months, that mattered almost as much as the temperature. The same insulation science behind these shelters, the multi-layer thermal barrier that traps body heat and blocks wind, works at a personal scale too. A product called the TerraShell uses that exact technology in a portable, windproof, insulated shell for about $300. If you've got elderly parents living alone, or you've been through one of those winter power outages that seem to get worse every year, it's worth looking at. I put a link in the description. But giving someone a warm bed doesn't connect them to a caseworker, a counselor, or a housing application. And that gap between warmth and recovery is where these programs start to strain. Burlington, Vermont launched its own pod community in 2023, and demand was so sustained that city officials pushed to keep it running for at least 3 more years. Residents described the experience positively, saying it gave them stability they hadn't felt in months. But the average length of stay climbed from 180 days when the site opened to 240 days 2 years later. People were living in emergency pods for 8 months because there simply wasn't affordable permanent housing available to move into. The pods were doing their job perfectly. The housing system behind them wasn't. States like Nevada, Vermont, and Oregon have all turned to modular pods for emergency or transitional housing in recent years. The momentum is real, but so are the bottlenecks. And in Lansing, Michigan, the gap between intention and execution was even worse. The city approved the purchase of 50 modular housing units called Mod Pods in the summer of 2025 for $640,000. But those pods weren't even rated for winter use and wouldn't be ready for occupancy until the following summer. So, during the Michigan winter that followed, with temperatures regularly dropping into single digits, people were still sleeping outside in the same parks where the city had recently ticketed them for doing exactly that. A pregnant woman was among those cited. The city had $640,000 worth of shelter sitting in a warehouse somewhere, not rated for the season when people actually needed it most. So what happens when a city actually builds the services around the shelter, not just the shelter itself? Salt Lake City answered that question. Working with the state of Utah, officials set up a micro-shelter community using hard-shell pods manufactured by a company called Fold'em. These pods featured lockable doors, electrical outlets, and built-in heating and air conditioning. The first pilot community housed up to 50 people on a site near downtown, staffed around the clock by caseworkers from a nonprofit called Switchpoint. The rules were straightforward. No drugs or alcohol or weapons, and 3 strikes meant you were out. One resident, a 48-year-old woman named Sydney, who had come to Utah from Illinois looking for work, described her pod as everything she needed. She said having her own space, away from shared germs and the chaos of a congregate shelter, gave her the stability to actually focus on getting into permanent housing. She could sleep through the night without worrying about her belongings being stolen. She could wake up in the morning and think about job applications instead of where she was going to sleep that night. The Utah legislature funded the expansion with roughly $25 million in state funding for what they called low-barrier shelter, and early data showed something that skeptics hadn't expected. People were actually exiting the pods into permanent housing. The program was functioning as a real bridge, not just a more comfortable dead end. If you're finding this useful, subscribe. I cover stories like this every week, practical solutions that don't make national headlines but are actually changing things on the ground. Now, the most creative version of this idea didn't come from America. It came from ULM, Germany. In 2018, the city put out an open challenge to a local innovation collective. The problem was simple. We have homeless people who can't go to shelters, and we don't want them to freeze to death. A team of 6 designers and technologists picked up the challenge and within 48 hours had the concept for what they called the ULMer Nest, a solar-powered sleeping capsule made from solid timber and powder-coated steel. Each capsule fits 1 or 2 people, with room for a pet or personal belongings. The pods are insulated against wind, cold, and moisture, with lockable doors, interior lighting, a ventilation system with a heat exchanger, and smoke detectors. But what makes them fundamentally different from anything built in the United States is the sensor network. Each pod connects to a monitoring system that tracks temperature, humidity, carbon dioxide levels, and occupancy in real time. When someone enters a pod for the night, a notification goes to social workers from a local care organization called Caritas. The next morning, a volunteer visits the site to check on the person and offer connections to counseling or housing programs. There are no cameras inside the pods, just motion sensors on the doors. The designers understood that privacy and dignity matter as much as warmth. Nobody wants to accept help from a system that treats them like a surveillance subject. What surprised the team most wasn't the technology, it was the community response. Neighbors living near the pods started bringing hot tea to overnight guests in the morning. City officials who had been skeptical became vocal supporters. One of the designers said the small moments meant the most. People walking up on the street to say thank you, both homeless residents and housed neighbors alike. The pods didn't just keep people warm, they made homelessness visible in a way that generated compassion instead of complaints. The project is still at prototype level, and scaling to mass production remains a challenge since each pod is assembled by hand. But the idea has already inspired similar projects across Europe, including emergency sleeper pods deployed by a British charity called Amazing Grace Spaces in communities across England. But even with all this momentum across 2 continents, the need is still outpacing the response by a terrifying margin. In Kansas City, outreach workers described scenes that sounded like they belonged in a different country. More than 1,000 people sleeping outside on any given night. Family homelessness spiking by 39% in a single year. Full families, parents, and children living on sidewalks after a single lost job or a single missed rent payment. One outreach worker described meeting a dad who lost his position a couple months back, couldn't cover the mortgage, didn't know anyone in the area, and just like that, the whole family was on the street. These weren't people with decades of substance abuse or mental illness. They were people who had been paying their bills 3 months earlier and ran out of margin. The pattern is consistent everywhere. Hypothermia deaths are climbing. The homeless population is getting older, and the systems designed to help are stretched past their breaking point. But where the thermal shelter approach is actually being deployed, it's working. Not because it solves homelessness. Nobody building a $300 insulated tent is claiming that, but because it keeps people alive long enough for other solutions to reach them. A $300 shelter in Aurora gave someone a warm night while a caseworker found them a subsidized apartment. A $7,500 pallet unit in Portland gave a man his first full night of sleep in months, which gave him the clarity to start working with a housing navigator. A solar-powered pod in Ulm connected a woman to counseling services she'd been avoiding for years because the pod was private enough to feel safe, and the morning visit from a volunteer was gentle enough to not feel like an interrogation. None of these structures are homes. They don't have running water or kitchens or mailing addresses. Some of them are barely bigger than a closet. But they do one thing exceptionally well. They stop the cold from killing people. And when the alternative is a cardboard box at -40 degrees, that engineering matters more than anything in the world. The cities getting this right aren't the richest ones or the most politically aligned ones. They're the ones that stopped asking, how do we solve homelessness? And started asking, how do we stop people from dying tonight? That shift, from solving the whole crisis to surviving the next 12 hours, is what led to the $300 thermal shelter. And it's saving lives right now, in church parking lots and under freeway overpasses, in places most of us drive past every single day without a second thought. In January 2025, it was too cold to even count the people sleeping outside in New York City. But in Aurora and Portland and Salt Lake City, those same temperatures weren't a death sentence anymore. They were just a problem that someone finally built a $300 answer to. And if you want to see how one city turned an abandoned parking lot into a fully operational shelter village in just 9 days, click the video on screen now.